Well, thanks very much, Matthew, and thank you to the RSA for hosting this at very short notice. I think this is what happens when you launch a leadership bid to lead the Labour Party back to power with only a few weeks' notice, that you ring up the RSA and say, I'd like to come and make a speech tomorrow, and they say, of course. And it's the mark of a good institution that they do. And one of the reasons that I wanted to do this here, and I wanted to do it today and with Matthew and others, is because the RSA is one of those institutions that is genuinely not just thoughtful and outward-looking, but challenging. And this is the moment for Labour, I think, when we need to up our game and challenge some of the assumptions that we've held on in the past. We've been losing for a long time now. We haven't won a majority for 15 years. And if we play it safe and take a business-as-usual approach, as I said, when we launched in Dagenham a few days ago, Labour will die, and it will deserve to. But there is a better future on offer, and today I want to focus on internationalism, one of those areas where in the Labour Party we often are proud to say that we have a proud internationalist history and we are a proud internationalist party. But now, at this critical moment, as Britain leaves the European Union, I want to ask, what does that mean? Because in recent years the question of internationalism has been reduced to a discussion on the left that can be reduced to one simple question: EU in or out. It's polarised the country, most of whom had much more complex, nuanced views on EU membership and EU structures than this reductionist debate would have us believe. So we were unable to hear those Leave voters who thought that close international cooperation was important, or those Remain voters who disliked some of the decisions and the direction that the EU had taken. Complexity was airbrushed from the debate, and we were unable to have an honest conversation about what needed to change, left defending what was, not being truthful with the public about how we would build better and more democratic cooperation with our closest neighbours. How could it be that Labour, a radical force for change that has only won 3 times in our history, when we've had an ambitious story to tell about the future of Britain and our place in the world, how could it be that we were on our back foot defending the status quo? One of the key problems with the referendum was that it failed to tell a story about our place in the world. Leave campaigners said that we were a small nation with a proud history of punching above our weight. Remain campaigners said, we'll cut your mobile phone roaming charges. And set against the seismic changes that are happening in the world beyond Europe, we didn't give any serious thought to what Britain's place in that world should be. 3.5 years later, we're still on the back foot. We've allowed the right to frame the debate into a series of false binaries, and in doing so, allowed a fully fledged culture war to be unleashed. The trap was set. You can be for your country, or you can be for the world. And senior Labour politicians rushed headlong into it. It was a serious failure of leadership. I know that the truth is more complicated than that. My Remain voting friends are no more liberal elites than my Leave voting neighbours are racist Little Englanders. And if we fail to recognise the validity of views on different sides of a debate, we let everybody down together. Winning the argument for a confident, open internationalist country will take leadership. Thinking big, not playing it safe, understanding that the referendum was a call for much more power and control, and that the response should never have been reduced solely to a technocratic debate about single market membership and the rights or wrongs of a customs union. And now that we're leaving the EU, our response to the referendum should be that moment. For Labour to reframe and to restate our commitment to internationalism and Britain's place in the world, we need to seize this moment. And we need to set out what we want this country to be. And I want to set out today how, under my leadership, Labour would do so, and in doing so, how we would set ourselves back on the road to power. The world is a complex place with power structures and forces that govern it constantly evolving. And throughout history, internationalism has evolved with it. Internationalism is the determination to solve global problems collectively and to improve the lot of workers and citizens through cooperation and solidarity. These are the challenges an internationalist must meet, but they change with every single generation. In the 1920s, the League of Nations was formed with the principal mission to maintain world peace. In the wake of 2 world wars, the end of the 40s saw the formation of NATO, and the UN, the main stalwarts of multilateral intervention and diplomacy across the world still today. In the 1950s and 60s, Europe's retreat from empire, the civil rights struggle by oppressed sections of societies, and the rise of feminism as a distinctive and powerful voice all contributed to seismic change in geopolitics and global society. And today, activists all over the world campaign together to warn against the dangers of climate change and complacency of governments across the globe. And for all the fear and insecurity in those decades, what runs through this like a silver thread is the rich history of international solidarity of workers throughout. But today we face a different but very real challenge. Internationalism itself is under attack as it has become associated with membership of the global liberal elite. As Theresa May so shamefully said in her speech to the Conservative Party conference in 2016, if you are a citizen of the world, you are a citizen of nowhere. There are voices calling for us to turn inwards. Just as America First and Make America Great Again have found resonance with so many people across the US, there are those here who maintain that a retreat into narrow nationalism will help resolve the problems we face, as if the sovereignty of our nation can be defined in aggressive opposition to its closest neighbours. But Labour has always stood for solidarity between nations, a solidarity based not on expedience but on values. Solidarity which at times we've been prepared to and had to go out and fight to defend. And in a world that's more interconnected than ever before, where many of the problems that we face are global in nature, it can only be that way. But we stand for this not just because it's a means to an end, but because it matters in its own right. Because we believe that through solidarity with one another, people across the world rise up together. Take the Indian cotton pickers and the Lancashire cotton mill workers of the 1930s, for example. This is a story that is deeply personal to me and to my family history, standing together in solidarity at great personal cost. Or the young people I met during the Arab Spring who'd put everything on the line to fight for freedom. It wasn't the hope that freedom would come that kept them going. They didn't know if it would. It was more the certain knowledge of what life was like without it. And the bravery of those young people convinced me that we cannot allow our values to drift. The world is complex and interlinked, but important principles may and must be inflexible. And that is the difference, for me, between my party and the Tories. Our values permeate internationalism, whereas their values appear to be negotiable. But we must acknowledge then that in recent times we have failed to infuse our internationalism with the values that we believe in. Russia is a regime that discriminates against LGBT people. It demonises Muslims and other minorities and suppresses basic rights. It's invaded its neighbour and occupied a chunk of its sovereign territory. It's used chemical weapons on the streets of the UK and murdered a homeless person. It was completely wrong that our response to this was to cast doubt on what happened and call only for dialogue. At a crucial moment, we hesitated in condemning an authoritarian regime that supports Donald Trump, that invades its neighbours, that steals its country's wealth, that interferes in elections in Europe and America, that attacks minority communities, and then used chemical weapons on the streets of the UK. We stood with the Russian government and not with the people it oppresses who suffer poverty and discrimination. We failed the test of solidarity. And as a result, we let the Tories get away with their own shocking weakness on Putin's Russia, suppressing the ISC report, failing to answer basic questions on their own funding by Russian oligarchs, letting the City of London become a paradise for corrupt money laundering. The Labour leadership failed on Russia, and we must put this right. And with the climate change crisis, the Labour Party is the right political movement in this country to lead the way. We know the threat this poses to the security of the world, and we know that it can only be solved by global cooperation on a truly ambitious scale. But we care about this not just because of the impact on GDP and investments, as real as that is, or because solving the challenge holds out the offer of a growth industry in the UK. We care because whether you're a victim of a flood, fire or drought, we know that in countries across the world it is the working classes and the poor who suffer most and suffer first. And we know that addressing this takes more than protest. It takes leadership. This is what defines Labour's internationalism that sees the world as it is and is clear-eyed about the challenges it faces, but is steadfast regardless in our commitment to build a better world and to preserve it for the generations to come. To live up to this commitment, we need more than just dreams. We need a plan. And that plan must take people with us. There was a moment, I believe, following the referendum result in 2016, where a national conversation on what would come next after we left the EU was possible. A genuine conversation that could see Leave and Remain voters come together to define what was important and to set a course for the UK that they could stand behind. Not perfect for any, but better for all. And because of that, the hardest path of all. But we missed the moment. We didn't try. And the lesson from history is that the path of least resistance has never pointed towards progress. 100 years ago this year, the League of Nations was formed. At its peak, the British branch had over 400,000 members. People committed to the ideals of peace, international justice and collective security. The League had many flaws and its history is largely written off as one of failure, but its successes should never be overlooked. Critically, it shows that human nature is rich enough to support an ideal that looks beyond our own horizons. And the movement behind the League of Nations was what created the space for a future Labour government to create the international infrastructure that survives to this day. This year we mark the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. It has its own problems, of course, but it has endured through the Cold War, the rise of China, the rebuilding of Japan and the decline of the European empires. And it survives to this day, built, negotiated and agreed by a Labour government, defended by successive Labour governments. That is what Labour governments do and must do again. Where is that movement for the 21st century? One that can work together within the international architecture we have and help breathe life into those institutions built to meet the challenges of a different era. In a world where too many leaders are cynically playing to domestic audiences, that has contributed to the escalation of tension with Iran, a progressive Labour government with a role in the UN Security Council, the OSCE, the Security Council and strong European partnerships would be part of an international alliance that rebuilds conflict prevention and international cooperation. In a world where financial transactions worth billions of pounds can be moved at the flick of a switch, where climate events in one part of the world directly affect the lives of people in another, we can build an international system people feel is much less remote and much more immediate than they felt about the European Union. Labour has to light that path by thinking bigger and on a more global scale. As we step out of the framework that has defined our international engagements for over 4 decades, where will our new alliances be forged? Which countries are interested in a rules-based international order and want to join our fight to tackle inequality and to tackle climate change? How and where can we use the skills, the expertise and the standing that Britain has to bring this cooperation to life? These are the questions that I pose to our Labour movement as we consider the biggest question of all, not just who should be our leader, but what kind of leadership do we need in the 21st century? We should be putting our efforts into developing good and deep relationships with those countries, whether Canada, Japan or New Zealand, and with the African Union as well. Not focusing solely on free trade agreements, but exploring how intergovernmental cooperation can be broad and productive, and how our joint participation in those multilateral organisations, the G7, the G20, can be brought to life through new alliances and partnerships. The focus on the EU, inevitable as it has been, has squeezed out that thinking. For all the talk of global Britain, we're at risk of retreating to an idea of a British Empire 2.0, not embracing the world and its challenges as they are now. And this is a huge challenge, and one we face at a time when in many places the principles of internationalism are in retreat. We will have to convince people that this is the right path, looking outwards, not in, working with others to be more than the sum of our parts, and balancing the need for international cooperation with a strong desire for much more sovereignty and control. To convince people we're up to this task, we need to be honest and upfront that no institutional international institution is perfect. And the results of international cooperation will sometimes be messy and they'll be flawed. But that nonetheless, the benefits will outweigh those downsides if we get this right. We should have been bold enough to defend free movement and the opportunities and benefits that it brings. But this would have required recognising that it has flaws and not dismissing concerns about the operation of free movement as simply racist anti-immigration sentiment. We should acknowledge that over decades, successive governments have used the steady influx of skilled labour to cover up a lack of investment in skills and training in the UK, and we should address this. I believe in free movement. Let me be clear about that. I've always been honest with my constituents, and I will be honest with the country. If it were paired with renewed and radical investment that enabled opportunities for young people, decent jobs, training and skills, then I know that those concerns about free movement would have fallen away. And I worry that over the last decades we've lost our ambition and we've lost our boldness. The legacy of the Iraq War still hangs over the Labour Party like a shadow. But before that disastrous decision to intervene in Iraq was the ethical foreign policy of Robin Cook and the life-saving intervention in Sierra Leone. And we must now have the confidence to move forward, not to shy away from facing the mistakes that we've made, but understanding that Labour has always been the party of ambition and reform. We aren't afraid to stand up and be counted. If we find ourselves the defenders of the status quo, unwilling, unable to rock the boat, something has gone seriously wrong. We must show that we're willing to live our values and stand by them, even when they have economic consequences or when we have to call out the behaviour of one of our closest allies. We can't turn up at the G20 and pledge our commitment to the Paris Agreement while continuing to use government money to invest in fossil fuel projects overseas, or export plastic waste to dump it in Southeast Asia. As we look forward to forge new trading alliances across the world, we'll need to make choices. We should be clear now that we would refuse to agree any trade deal with a country that has not ratified the Paris Agreement. We must use trade to support climate action, not hamper it. It's easy to blame Trump as a single destabilising force, but the UK shouldn't rest on this as an excuse for lack of action on a global level. In a crucial year when we'll host a crunch UN climate summit for the first time, now is the time to step up. Labour, its activists, its councillors and the movement we've built brims with ideas and energy about how we can tackle difficult issues that are common, whether you're in Wigan or in Washington. And as Labour's Shadow Energy Secretary, I was privileged to attend COP21 and witness the agreement of that landmark Paris Agreement. But it was mayors from major cities across the world, including our own here in Britain, who were driving this change, not just world leaders alone. And we should be willing to take this energy and the spirit of all our people across the country to revitalise our participation in the G7 and the G20. It's surely Labour, with its history of international solidarity, trade unions, cooperative movements, who can bring ideas for collective action, whether we're talking about tackling inequality, terrorism, tax evasion, or climate change. There is a false divide between local and international action, but as CLR James once said, genuine internationalism must be based on the national scene. At crucial times in world's history, Labour has stood up and sought to lead the way. It was a Labour government that committed to international development funding of 0.7% of GDP, and it was a Labour government that built the expertise in state-to-state support that is still seen as world-class today. And I seek permission to lead a Labour government that would take this expertise and push the UN Security Council to broaden its support to war-torn countries, to coordinate and deliver support across governance, aid and security combined. Uniquely, the UK has so much to offer across each, but it's only by bringing them together that we can drive the deep, fundamental, lasting change the world needs. In recent years, as you may know, I've committed myself to the challenges facing towns here in the UK. But if we don't make the link between what happens in Bolton and what happens in post-industrial towns across the world, we force internationalism into irrelevance. These are challenges that we can meet. Labour is not yet in power, but we should never believe that we are powerless. Just as Democratic and Republican mayors stood up for the Paris Agreement and stood up to Trump, I will lead a team of Labour mayors and local leaders to lead the way on climate action in the UK and contribute to international action. The Labour I lead will lead by example. We don't have to wait for a Labour government to act. We are already in power in many towns and cities across the UK, and I want to use that power to show what Labour can do. We can take the experience and efforts of trade unions in fighting the worst of labour market practices today and take that to build global consensus, ultimately to improve working conditions not just here but across the world. We can understand how extremism is allowed to develop and work at a global level to keep us safe while working locally to build a confident, empowered country where people's better instincts can thrive. I've fought for the rights of migrant workers in the UK all my life. And unlike Boris Johnson, I know that the so-called Red Wall communities do too, because I live there. And these aren't just voters to me, these are my friends, my family, my neighbours and my constituents. And that is because my values run through the internationalism that I aspire to and that Labour must too. They are the values which define my commitment to the Labour Party and which must form the keystone of the red bridge that Labour in opposition will build to connect towns and cities across the UK. And the red bridge that we'll build in government too, to connect nations to one another. These are my values, Labour values, our country's values. A new Labour internationalism for the new age, a Labour vision for global Britain, for peace, for the planet, for prosperity, and most of all for people. The Labour Party I lead will move on from arguments over Iraq and Brexit to set out a new role in the world, defending British interests and building a better world. This is the country I know we can be. We can be better than this. It's the country that I've believed in all my life, but never quite seen. It's within touching distance. I can see it and I can almost feel it. And we will win this if we build it together. Thank you.